If ADHD is like a super energetic squirrel and autism is like a super sensitive dog, like an English setter, for example, auDHD, being both autistic and ADHD, is kind of like being both the squirrel and the dog chasing it. It's chaos, it's confusing, it's contradictory, and it's definitely different from solely being autistic or solely being ADHD. So how can you tell which one is what's going on in your brain? While this video is absolutely not diagnostic, I do support self-diagnosis, and I hope that this video can be one step in your journey to figuring out how your brain works. Let's start with ADHD, and what we're gonna do is we're gonna go through the criteria in the DSM, which is the Diagnostic Statistical Manual, which is the diagnostic tool used in the United States. Then we're gonna go through my criteria for ADHD, which I compiled using a ton of research and the lived experience of both myself and other ADHDers. And finally, I'm gonna leave you with some recommendations for solely ADHD creators who I think can provide a really good perspective on what it's like to have ADHD without autism. So the DSM criteria divides ADHD into inattentive symptoms and hyperactive symptoms. You need to have 5 or more total, I believe, in order to receive an ADHD diagnosis, and they need to have been present for at least 6 months and be developmentally inappropriate. Basically what this means is just if you have a 4-year-old who fidgets a lot, like that's pretty normal. If you have a 4-year-old who literally can't even sit down for 5 minutes because they are fidgeting so much, that's maybe a little less normal. So the inattentive symptoms are fails to give close attention to details or makes careless mistakes. I think this is a bit of a judgmental word, but that's fine. In schoolwork, at work, or in other activities. Often has trouble holding attention on tasks or play activities. I like that they include play because ADHD does not just affect our work, it also affects the things we do for fun. Does not seem to listen when spoken to directly. Does not follow through on instructions and fails to finish schoolwork, chores, or duties in the workplace. Has trouble organizing tasks and activities. Avoids, dislikes, or is reluctant to do tasks that require mental effort over a long period of time. Often loses things necessary for tasks and activities. Is easily distracted and is often forgetful in daily activities. These are the inattentive symptoms. So next up are the hyperactive and impulsive symptoms, and here's what those are. Often fidgets with or taps hands or feet or squirms in seat. Often leaves seat in situations where remaining seated is expected. Often runs about or climbs in situations where it's not appropriate. Adolescents or adults may be limited to feeling very restless. I love that they've included that. Unable to play or take part in leisure activities quietly. Is often on the go or acting as if driven by a motor. Often talks excessively. Often blurts out an answer before a question has been completed, and often has trouble waiting their turn. And finally, often interrupts or intrudes on others, aka butting into conversations or games. Additionally, the DSM points out that in addition to those symptoms, you must have had several of your symptoms before age 12. Several symptoms are present in 2 or more settings, aka it can't just be at home or just be at work, because then the setting might be the problem rather than like actually having ADHD. There is clear evidence that the symptoms interfere with or reduce the quality of social, school, or work functioning, and symptoms are not better explained by something else. So that's how the DSM defines ADHD. And I actually don't hate the DSM criteria for ADHD. They're not the worst, but I also don't think they're the best. And the reason for that is that it's very focused on how we inconvenience others. The DSM doesn't totally cover what it's like to be ADHD and how it feels for us. It typically involves more how our behavior affects the people around us. And so for my upcoming book, which if you're interested in getting the book, it should be out in 2025, go ahead to the link in the description so you can get on the waitlist so you don't miss it. But in my upcoming book, I define a different set of criteria for ADHD that is based on a ton of research and lived experience of both my own and people around me. First and foremost, my criteria talk about executive functioning, and there are actually 8 types of executive functioning, and they can all go wrong when you have ADHD because ADHD is primarily an executive functioning condition. Those 8 executive functions are impulse control, emotional regulation, task initiation, working memory, flexible thinking, self-monitoring, planning and prioritization, and organization. And if you want to learn more about those, you can check out this video up here. So beyond acknowledging that ADHD is primarily focused on executive functioning, I also divided the traits of ADHD into input, output, and disability. Input is basically the way that an ADHD brain differs in the way we process incoming information. And some of those input differences include no input filter, which basically means that a lot of people think of ADHDers as not having an output filter. We kind of say whatever comes to our brain, but we also don't have an input filter. We can't sift through all the information that is coming our way. ADHD often isn't a lack of attention, it's trouble regulating it. And one way this manifests is that we notice everything all the time at the same time, which makes it really hard to tell what's important to focus on. Number 2 is rejection sensitive dysphoria. This is something that's not currently in the DSM, but it's widely accepted in the ADHD community. And this is that ADHDers tend to be much more sensitive to rejection than non-ADHDers. And there's much debate over whether this is because ADHDers are actually rejected more often, and so we become more sensitive to it. So whether it's more of a trauma thing, or if it's an innate part of ADHD, maybe we're just more sensitive to the concept of rejection. Number 3 is boredom. ADHDers are very sensitive to boredom. Boredom feels physically painful for many of us in a way that many non-ADHDers are not going to be able to understand. Number 4 is emotional dysregulation. As I mentioned before, ADHD tends to come with a lot of regulation issues, and that can apply to focus, but it can also apply to our emotions. Many ADHDers deal with something called emotional object permanence struggles, which is where if you're not feeling something in the moment, it's hard to imagine that you will ever feel it again, or maybe that you've ever felt it before. Number 5 is increased habituation, and habituation is basically getting used to something in your environment. So ADHDers are very easily able to tune out repetitive sounds, especially repetitive sounds that we ourselves are making in order to like stim and stimulate ourselves, right? So that we can pay attention better, but we don't even notice we're like making all of these sounds because we've habituated to it. And finally, number 6 is hyperfocus. And I've included this because the DSM currently doesn't address hyperfocus. And I think it's a huge part of ADHD in that we have trouble regulating our attention, which often results in distractibility, but can also result in that like tunnel vision focus. So next up we have output, which is how all of those input differences are reflected in our behavior externally. And for this, I have divided it into inattentive and hyperactive. So some of the inattentive output signs of ADHD are difficulty working with minutia, details, the small nitty-gritty things. We have trouble with that. We also have trouble starting tasks, finishing tasks, and we may switch between tasks very, very frequently in an attempt to find something that feels regulating. We also have a very serious misperception of time, sometimes called time blindness, although many people in the blind community have asked the ADHD community to move away from that term. Misperception of time basically means that we have a very hard time perceiving the way time passes. So we might be standing in line and it feels like actually literally hours and it's been maybe 10 minutes. But also we might be working on something we love and it feels like 10 minutes when it's literally been hours. It's not that we're not paying attention to time, it's that we do not perceive it at all. The next inattentive sign is lack of environmental awareness. So if you've ever been called a space cadet, that's this one. You just don't always know what's going on around you. And finally, the last inattentive sign is losing things. This is in the DSM and I really agree with it. It happens to a lot of us a lot of the time. Next up are the hyperactive symptoms, starting with fidgeting. We do tend to fidget a lot because fidgeting provides stimulation and sometimes ADHDers need extra stimulation in order to focus. Next up is interrupting. We do tend to interrupt a lot. Again, this is in the DSM and I happen to agree with it. And the third hyperactive sign of ADHD is difficulty processing energy. So you know how some folks are lactose intolerant? A lot of ADHDers are like that, but with energy, we cannot process it in a way that is useful for us, either internally or externally. So here, let's break that down. Internally, studies show that ADHDers experience a higher sense of internal restlessness compared to non-ADHDers. We have a ton of energy inside and we do not have a good process for getting that energy out. And then externally, we see this, especially in the DSM criteria that says we are driven by a motor or appear to be driven by a motor. I actually really love that that's in the DSM. It's like so metaphorical. It doesn't feel as cold and clinical as much of the DSM does. And it really feels like we are a car with the brick on the gas pedal. We cannot seem to stop even when we would like to. And finally, we need to acknowledge the disability aspect of ADHD. This combination of different input and output often leads to disability. In some ways, this is due to a world that prioritizes the neurotypical experience, of course, but also even if society changed to be more inclusive, there are still going to be disabling aspects of ADHD. And if you're uncomfortable with the word disability, you don't have to use it. It's completely up to you, but I do talk about disability, autism, and ADHD in my book. Again, you can go to the link in the description and hop on the waitlist to make sure you don't miss it. So those are the DSM criteria and my criteria for only experiencing ADHD. If this resonates with you like profoundly, then congratulations, you know something more about yourself. I think that's great. If you want to keep learning more from people who are also solely ADHD, I really recommend you check out Jessica from How to ADHD. Obviously one of the best channels on YouTube, especially one of the best channels about ADHD. And if you're more of an Instagram kind of person, I really recommend you check out Rissa and Dree over at Black Girl ADHD on Instagram. They have so many good resources, especially for Black girls who are ADHD. All right, moving on to autism, solely autism. Hey, what is that? Oh, this is my autism discovery binder. This is the tool that I created when I wasn't super sure if I was autistic or not, and I needed a place to store all of my thoughts about it. Wow, you made a whole binder? That sounds overwhelming, but convenient? Yeah, this is definitely a labor of love. There's so much in here. I compiled all of the free self-assessments I could find online. I created a spreadsheet to track my traits and symptoms. And then I also put together a bunch of different studies that I could then print out, highlight, and annotate. Okay, well, I was actually gonna talk to you about this because I've been thinking I might be autistic, and this looks really helpful. Is there any way I could get I don't know, my own copy? Of course, I actually sell the digital version of this binder in my shop. It usually costs $25, but for Black Friday, I'm doing a sale where you can pay what you want. I can pay what I want? That is so generous, thank you. I'll be sure to go check out the binder. Yeah, you should definitely go get the binder on Black Friday, but it's actually my whole shop that's pay what you want Black Friday through Cyber Monday. So if you wanna make sure you don't forget about the deal, go to the link in the description to sign up for reminder emails. Oh my goodness, I'm absolutely gonna do that. Thank you so much for letting me know about this. So let's go ahead and start with the DSM criteria of autism, which, fair warning, are very deficits-based. So if that model doesn't align with you, this might be a little upsetting. So just so you know, the DSM very much views autism as a negative thing. So there are two main categories to be diagnosed with autism. There are A, persistent deficits in social communication and social interaction across multiple contexts, manifested by the following, which we'll give some examples here in a minute, and B, restricted repetitive patterns of behavior, interest, or activities as manifested by the following, which again, we'll give some examples. So let's start with part A, the social communication struggles. First up, we have deficits in social emotional reciprocity. For example, abnormal social approach and failure of normal back and forth conversation, reduced sharing of interests, emotion, or affect, which is emotional expression on your face, failure to initiate or respond to social interactions. The second one is deficits in nonverbal communicative behaviors for social interaction, ranging from, for example, poorly integrated verbal and nonverbal communication to abnormalities in eye contact and body language, or deficits in understanding and use of gestures to a total lack of facial expressions and nonverbal communication. And 3 is deficits in developing, maintaining, and understanding relationships. For example, difficulties adjusting behavior to suit various social contexts, difficulties in sharing imaginative play or in making friends, or an absence of interest in peers. Then we have part B, which is all about restricted repetitive patterns of behavior, interest, or activities. And here are some of the ways that can manifest. Stereotyped or repetitive motor movements, use of objects or speech, aka echolalia, which is where you repeat things or make a certain sound over and over as a form of stimming. Number 2 is insistence on sameness, inflexible adherence to routines, or ritualized patterns of verbal or non-verbal behavior. This can look like scripting. This can look like having a very strict schedule. This can look like lining things up. 3, highly restricted fixated interests that are abnormal in intensity or focus, a strong attachment to or preoccupation with unusual objects, excessively circumscribed or preservative interests, basically meaning we have interests that last a really long time and that we are very, very into. And 4, hyper or hypo reactivity to sensory input or an unusual interest in sensory aspects of the environment, aka maybe an apparent indifference to pain or temperature, adverse response to specific sounds or textures, excessive smelling or touching of objects, and visual fascination with lights or movement. Again, much like ADHD, the autism criteria also specify that these symptoms must be present in the early developmental period. However, the autism criteria does specify that these may not fully manifest until social demands exceed limited capacities, which can be really helpful for diagnosing autism later in life. It also mentions that symptoms cause clinically significant impairment in social, occupational, or other important areas of functioning, and that it's not better explained by something else. So that's the DSM criteria. I do find that it is very deficits-based. It's very much focused on what we cannot do, which, to be fair, there is stuff that a lot of autistic people cannot do, and I'm not against acknowledging that. I just think it's also important to acknowledge what we can do, or to phrase these things in a way that's a little less judgmental or saying that we're failing at something when really we're just doing it differently. So once again, with my criteria, I have divided it into input, output, and disability. So let's go ahead and dive in. First, for input for autism, we have the social, emotional, cognitive connection. I have a whole video about this that you can watch up here about the bucket theory of autism. Highly recommend it, but basically our social, emotional, and cognitive input can affect each other in a way that doesn't usually happen with non-autistic people. Next up, we have differences in sensory processing. This can look like hyper or hyposensitivity, which the DSM does acknowledge, but it can also look like a lack of habituation, which means we have a very hard time not constantly paying attention to sources of input, even if they've been around for a long time. So like, you'll hear a lot of autistic people talk about how they can hear the electricity in their home and it drives them like totally batty. And most people, if they can hear that, just tune it out pretty quickly. But a lot of autistic people can't tune it out. Next up, we have emotional processing. This can look like a couple things, including alexithymia, which is difficulty identifying or expressing your emotions, hyper or hyposensitivity to emotions. We can be just as hyper or hyposensitive to emotions as we are to sensory input. And also emotional dysregulation, just like with ADHD. This can look like intense mood swings, strong, seemingly inappropriate emotional reactions that are often very appropriate once you actually know what's going on internally. Third, we've got cognitive processing, and there are two main things here. The first is attention to detail and cognitive overload. Many autistic people have a bottom-up processing style, which means we pay attention to the nitty-gritty details. We totally miss the forest for the trees. We really pay attention to individual details a lot of the time. And the second thing is rigid thinking patterns, which the DSM does touch on. A lot of us tend to have black and white thinking, obsessive tendencies, highly literal thinking, or highly metaphorical thinking. And finally, we have social processing. So you can be hyper or hyposensitive to social experiences, and you may react to those experiences and those hyper or hyposensitivity in a way that looks very abnormal to neurotypical expectations. Next up, we have output. So there are lots of ways that those input differences result in different outputs. For example, many, though not all, autistic people are non-speaking to some degree. Some people are non-speaking entirely. They do not speak. Sometimes this has been called nonverbal, but I think we're moving away from that term because many non-speaking people do possess verbal processing abilities. They just don't speak out loud. And nonverbal sometimes gives the indication that people don't have like verbal reasoning at all, which sometimes is the case, and that's valid too, but sometimes is not the case. Additionally, many autistic people experience what are called like non-speaking episodes or verbal shutdowns, I believe is what a lot of people are calling them. And this is where you go through a period of time where you cannot or have incredible difficulty speaking. Number two on the output is stimming. So all human beings stim, which is just like self-stimulatory behavior, but autistic folks engage in more frequent and more obvious stimming, such as hand flapping, hair twirling, jumping, spinning, and more. And this stimming may relieve sensory, emotional, or cognitive stress. Next up are meltdowns and shutdowns. So there are three different categories I want to explore here. First is externalized meltdowns. This is what you might call a classic meltdown, where an autistic person finds a way to outwardly express their distress through hitting things, shouting, running away, aka eloping, or other outward behaviors. Then there are internalized meltdowns. These meltdowns might look mild on the outside, crying, pacing, staring into space, etc., but internally they are just as chaotic and distressing as an externalized meltdown. There is a lot of energy internally, and the person may experience a lot of negative self-talk, spiraling, racing thoughts, or even suicidal ideation. And finally, we have shutdowns. Shutdowns are basically when the nervous system has the opposite reaction. Instead of turning turning the dial up to 11, it gets shut off entirely. And internally, this experience can be very, very dissociative. Okay, moving away from meltdowns and shutdowns, there are a couple more output things I want to cover. Next up is special interests, which the DSM does talk about a little bit, but a lot of us have very, very specialized knowledge in areas that we love. And that's just a cornerstone of autism. Then we have hyper or hypo-expressive facial expressions and body language. Many autistic folks are hypo-expressive, meaning we don't express things on our face naturally anyway. But some autistic folks are hyper-expressive on our face. I think I am very hyper-expressive with my voice. Some of it is like acting, some of it I do on purpose, but some of it's natural. Sometimes I just speak like this. And a lot of times people will mimic the people they're around. I know I have mimicked comedians and actors and my friends, not intentionally. It just, a lot of autistic people, we just pick up on what other people are doing and we do it back. So the next one is routines and resistance to change. And I think this is largely due to rigid thinking patterns and also existing in a society that does not prioritize our accommodations. So many of us follow a strict routine and have a lot of trouble with change because it's hard to adapt to changed plans when you're not sure if the new plan is going to meet your sensory, emotional, cognitive, or social needs. And finally, we have pretty much the same criteria as with ADHD, which is the disability factor, where this combination of input and output differences often leads to disability, which could be explained by society not being very accepting of autistic folks, but there are also aspects of autism that are disabling regardless. So those are the DSM criteria and my criteria from my upcoming book. And finally, I want to give you some folks to follow. I highly recommend Irene over at The Thought Spot here on YouTube, one of the best autism channels here on YouTube. And I also want to recommend Nadia over at Autistic Black Girl on Instagram. Again, this is really great if you are a Black woman who is solely autistic. So what about ADHD? What about if you're both? Do you just have all the symptoms of both, or do you like flip back and forth between them? The truth is, when you're ADHD, you may experience some weird combinations of these traits and symptoms. So of course, I've come up with my own criteria for ADHD specifically. Again, we've broken things down into input, output, and disability. Disability is the same, so we're not going to go over that again, but input can look like inconsistent sleep needs. Most adults need around 7 hours of sleep per night, and young adults or people recovering from illness or a sleep deficit may need 9+ hours a night, so you're probably not getting enough sleep regardless. But a lot of ADHDers tend to swing back and forth between genuinely needing less sleep, being able to function perfectly well off of maybe 5 or 6 hours, and then swinging to the other end of the spectrum where they genuinely need at least 10 hours to get through their days. This is a pattern you're probably going to notice in these criteria, where ADHDers tend to struggle with regulation or finding any kind of middle ground. Also, in addition, when it comes to sleep, ADHDers are more likely to struggle with something called delayed sleep-wake phase disorder, which is where our melatonin gets produced later in the evening so that we're not actually tired until 2 or 3 in the morning, as opposed to getting tired around 10 or 11. Next up is emotional dysregulation. This was mentioned in both the autism criteria and the ADHD criteria, so it felt like we obviously had to include it here. Many ADHDers really struggle with big mood swings and feelings of overwhelm when it comes to their emotions. In fact, many ADHDers experience so much emotional dysregulation that we tend to be misdiagnosed with bipolar disorder before we are diagnosed as either autistic, ADHD, or both. And there are many studies that confirm that this misdiagnosis is a pattern. Finally, many ADHDers have a very narrow window of tolerance, meaning that if there's too much stimulation, we get overstimulated, but if there's not enough, we are painfully bored and we also cannot focus. We have a very narrow window where we actually feel okay. Next up, we have the output. So this is how all of those internal differences can represent in the physical world where others can see. First up is you probably fit into one of these 3 categories, which is teacher's pet, class clown, or problem child. Some ADHDers take on the role of teacher's pet, finding security through being liked and approved of by an authority figure. Other ADHDers become more of a class clown, using humor to distract from our near constant discomfort. And finally, many ADHDers are labeled as problem children, who, even if we try to resist that label at first, we give in eventually because everything we do seems to make everyone think we are a problem. The next trait in the output section is, but you're so normal.
No! God, please, no! No! No!
Raise your hand if you've tried to tell somebody about your autism, ADHD, or both and received this response, because many times autism and ADHD can look like they cancel each other out on the outside, when in reality, internally, they are causing a war inside of us. And finally, studies have long shown that ADHD is associated with increased risk of substance use disorder, but more recent studies show that the combination of ADHD and autism is also highly linked with substance use disorders and increased vulnerability to dependence. Now, this probably has a lot to do with neurology, but if I had to hazard a guess, it also probably has something to do with how overwhelming the world is and how substances often numb some of that. And it could also be related to how uncomfortable we are in social situations and the fact that substances are often used as a social lubricant, and that this is okay as long as you don't abuse them. But many ADHDers, due to our constant discomfort, may start using substances in a way that is unhelpful for us. So that's ADHD, autism, and auDHD. Now you might be wondering, great, I've got all of this information. I love this, super helpful. Now, how do I know what it is? As I said at the beginning of the video, I'm a big proponent of self-diagnosis. However, I myself am professionally diagnosed, and I know there's a lot of value in that as well. If you're interested in self-diagnosis but aren't sure where to find a good assessor who actually knows what the hell they're talking about, you can go to the description and check out the Neuroclastic directory of Diagnosticians. This is where I found my assessor. She was amazing. To this day, probably one of the most competent mental health professionals I've ever worked with. And I really hope that you find somebody who is affordable in your area and knows what they're doing. So you might be wondering, okay, what do I do next? I know that's what I was wondering when I first started to realize, oh shit, I'm autistic, and oh wait, am I ADHD too? Like, when I started to put this stuff together, it was really overwhelming and I did not know what to do next. Here's what I would do if I were you. First, you want to brainstorm your traits and symptoms. Just have a note open in your notes app or a little notebook you carry around, and anytime you notice yourself doing something that is maybe unhelpful for you or that other people don't seem to be doing, you can go ahead and write it down and figure out, you know, is this autism, ADHD? Could it be a sign of both? And could it be a sign of something else potentially? Next up, you want to brainstorm accommodations and self-care that work for you. One of the best pieces of advice I ever got, and one of the best pieces of advice I give to people, is start accommodating yourself as though you have an official diagnosis now, because it hurts no one. And finally, the third thing that you can always do is work with me. I am a life coach. I love working with ADHD folks, but I also work with people with other neurodivergencies or who are solely ADHD or solely autistic. I really love this stuff, and I have a lot of tools that I can teach you. If you think you might be ready to work with me, go to the link in the description to book a discovery call, and that way we can figure out if we're a good fit to work together. I know this was a long one, but thank you for sticking with me. I hope it was helpful, and I will see you all next time.